Whispers in the desert. In the heat of the late 11th century, amid the shifting sands and rugged mountains of Persia, something unusual began to stir. Our story begins not with the clash of armies or the crowning of kings, but with whispers. Rumours carried on the wind spoke of a secretive sect, a brotherhood hidden within the folds of Islam, bound together by devotion, discipline, and daggers. This was no ordinary movement. It was the seed of the society we would come to know as the Assassins. The world they were born into was a turbulent one. The Seljuk Turks dominated much of Persia and the Middle East, enforcing orthodox Sunni rule over a mosaic of communities. Within this landscape, the Shia minority, particularly the Nizari Ismailis, lived under suspicion, their beliefs often persecuted, their scholars driven into the margins. Yet it was from this oppressed soil that the assassin sect would grow, fueled by the genius of one man who dreamed of carving out a haven of independence. That man was Hassan-i Sabbah, a name destined to echo across centuries. Born around 1050 in the Persian city of Qom, Hassan was raised in the Ismaili faith, which at the time was itself a branch of Shia Islam, tracing allegiance to a different line of imams than the dominant currents. A brilliant student, he travelled to Cairo, the seat of the Fatimid Caliphate, where he immersed himself in theology, philosophy, and strategy. His return to Persia was not as a wandering scholar, but as a missionary with a purpose. By 1090, Hassan had found what he sought, a fortress high in the Elburz Mountains, a place nearly impregnable called Alamut. Its name, in the local tongue, meant eagle's nest. It was here, in a citadel perched above the clouds, that Hassan would lay the foundation for his fabled society. Some chronicles claim he gained the fortress not by storming it, but through cunning, convincing its guardian that the stronghold was better surrendered than fought over. Scholars still debate whether this tale of bloodless conquest is true or merely embroidered in later retellings, but the image of Hassan, a master of persuasion as much as the sword, is hard to resist. The assassins did not begin as a grand conspiracy. In their earliest days, they were a beleaguered sect, clinging to survival in a hostile world. Yet, out of necessity, they learned to wield subtlety where brute force failed. They adopted secrecy as armour, devotion as their bond, and rumour as their ally. In the valleys below Alamut, peasants whispered of strange initiations, of disciples vanishing into the fortress and emerging as unflinching devotees. Some spoke of gardens hidden within, lush with forbidden delights. Others said the mountain itself was enchanted, that no army could hope to dislodge the men who lived in its heights. A quirky tidbit survives in a medieval chronicle. It tells of peasants claiming to see hawks circling Alamut, each bird bearing tiny slips of paper tied to its claws, cryptic messages from Hassan himself, or so the rumour went. It was likely a fable, a fanciful attempt to explain how information travelled so swiftly in those mountains. Still, it speaks to the aura of mystery the sect cultivated from its very inception. The political backdrop was as significant as the myths. The Seljuk sultans saw Hassan and his followers as dangerous heretics, rebels undermining Sunni authority. For Hassan, this opposition only sharpened his resolve. He was not merely building a refuge, he was constructing a state within a state, a fortress network that could defy even the mightiest rulers. The assassins, as we now call them, were not born in blood, but in whispers, whispers that would soon grow into shouts carried far beyond Persia, all the way to the courts of Europe. It is important to remember, though, that even in these early moments, legend and history were already becoming entangled. To hostile chroniclers, Hassan was a fanatic leading a band of killers. To his followers, he was the old man of the mountain, a spiritual guide offering salvation through sacrifice. Scholars still debate whether his vision was primarily religious, an attempt to preserve Ismaili beliefs against persecution, or political, a cold strategy to carve out independence in a fractured landscape? Perhaps it was both. What is certain is that the assassins were never merely thugs with knives. They were the product of a world that demanded cunning, secrecy, and survival against overwhelming odds. As the sun set over the Persian highlands and the shadows lengthened across the valleys, the whispers grew louder. A secret society was taking root, high in its eagle's nest, preparing to cast its influence far and wide. The stage was set, and soon the world would tremble at the mention of their name, the Old Man of the Mountain. By the dawn of the 12th century, a singular figure had begun to dominate the imagination of friend and foe alike. Hassan-i Sabbah, ensconced within the lofty heights of Alamut, had become more than just a leader. He was a legend in the making. His enemies, unable to breach his mountain fortress, resorted to naming him with awe and fear, the Old Man of the Mountain. The title itself was a gift from his adversaries. To the Seljuk rulers and their chroniclers, Hassan was a menace, a shadowy master directing daggers from afar. To his disciples, he was a spiritual father, the very embodiment of devotion to the Nizari Ismaili cause. And yet, there is irony here. Hassan was not particularly old when he began his rule at Alamut. The epithet seems to have grown later, embroidered by Crusaders and medieval storytellers. Scholars still debate whether Old Man was meant as literal age, a mark of reverence, or simply a label to conjure mystery for Western ears. Inside the fortress, Hassan's presence was formidable. Chronicles suggest he lived with an austere simplicity. He renounced the pleasures of the world, even forbidding music and unnecessary ornamentation within Alamut. His focus was singular, the survival and strength of his sect. Legend holds that when one of his sons was accused of drinking wine, Hassan ordered his execution to prove that no one, not even his family, was above discipline. Whether this tale is literal truth or later exaggeration, it illustrates the image he cultivated, a leader whose authority was absolute, whose word was law. From the battlements of Alamut, Hassan governed like no other ruler of his time. He had no vast army, no sweeping empire. What he commanded instead was loyalty sharpened into a weapon. His followers, bound by secrecy and faith, became his eyes, ears, and, when required, his daggers in the dark. Hassan understood something few of his contemporaries grasped, that power did not always rest in armies or crowns, but in the ability to inspire fear, to make a sultan or vizier glance over his shoulder in the middle of a crowded court. A curious tidbit lingers in accounts from the region. Peasants in nearby villages told stories of Hassan never once leaving Alamut after he claimed it. They said he became like the eagle of the fortress's name, ruling from his high nest, remote yet omnipresent. The notion of a man ruling a movement without ever stepping down from his mountain only fed the aura of mystery. Some modern historians argue he may indeed have stayed secluded, relying on a web of messengers to project his will outward. Scholars still debate whether this seclusion was practical necessity, religious devotion, or carefully staged theatre designed to magnify his myth. For his followers, Hassan was not merely a commander, he was a spiritual shepherd guiding them towards salvation. He promised them a place within the fold of the true Imam, a sense of belonging in a hostile world. But for his enemies, the Old Man of the Mountain became a nightmare, a phantom whose assassins could appear at any moment, at prayer, in court, or even in bedchambers. It was said that rulers would awake at night to find a dagger planted beside their pillows, a silent warning that their lives were spared only at Hassan's pleasure. Whether or not this ever truly occurred, the stories spread like wildfire, magnifying his reach beyond what his numbers could ever achieve. The contrast between the austere, almost monastic man inside Alamut and the terror his name inspired beyond its walls is striking. This dual image, holy leader and shadowy puppet master, gave birth to a mythos that has persisted for nearly 1,000 years. His enemies painted him as a manipulator, feeding his disciples hashish to trick them into obedience, while his followers revered him as a man of unwavering faith and intellect. Somewhere in the tension between these extremes lies the truth, though we will never quite untangle it. Hassan-i Sabbah died in 1124, after more than 3 decades ruling from his eagle's nest. He left behind no wealth, no dynastic succession, only a system of fortified strongholds and a legend of loyalty and fear. Even in death, his shadow lingered over Alamut and the network of fortresses he had seeded across Persia and Syria. His successors would inherit his strategies, his legends, and his enemies. The old man of the mountain had built more than a sect. He had built a story so powerful it would outlast the very stones of Alamut itself. As the decades passed, his name would travel far beyond Persia, carried by crusaders returning to Europe, whispered in royal courts, and written into chronicles. But here, in the early 12th century, atop a fortress shrouded in mountain mists, Hassan-i Sabbah remained both man and myth, an eagle watching over his flock and a shadow haunting the dreams of kings. Castles in the clouds, high above the valleys of Persia and Syria, where clouds rolled like tides against the ridges of the Elbers and Syrian mountains, the assassins built their world in stone. These were not palaces for kings or temples for gods, but fortresses for survival. Castles in the clouds, seemingly unreachable, and yet central to the sect's enduring power. The first and greatest of these was, of course, Alamut. Acquired by Hassan-i Sabbah in 1090, it became the spiritual and administrative heart of his movement. Perched more than 6,000 feet above sea level, Alamut was a marvel of strategic genius. The fortress commanded views of the surrounding valleys, and its narrow access routes could be defended by a handful of men against thousands. Chroniclers spoke of secret water reservoirs, granaries filled with grain for years of siege, and even libraries of treasured manuscripts. In a world where armies often triumphed by starving their enemies, Alamut seemed built to endure. But Alamut was not alone. Over the next decades, the Nizari Ismailis, whom history remembers as assassins, expanded their network of strongholds. From the rock fortress of Lamasar to the rugged heights of Girdku, their castles dotted the Persian landscape like sentinels. Each one was chosen with care, remote enough to resist assault, yet close enough to valleys where supplies could be gathered and information spread. A quirky detail from medieval sources claims that some of these castles were linked by underground tunnels spanning impossible distances, allowing assassins to vanish from one fortress and reappear in another. While such claims stretch the limits of plausibility, they speak to how outsiders viewed the sect's ability to move unseen and strike unpredictably. In Syria too, the assassins established footholds, including the fortress of Masyaf. It was here in later generations that another figure, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, would earn his own epithet as the Syrian Old Man of the Mountain. The castles of Syria, like those in Persia, were chosen for their ability to defy larger armies. When crusaders or local dynasties marched against them, they often found themselves repelled not by sheer numbers, but by the daunting topography. Imagine the frustration of a king who commanded thousands of soldiers, only to see them defeated by cliffs, narrow passes, and defenders who knew every rock and ridge by heart. These fortresses were more than military bastions. They were the heart of assassin society. Within their walls lived not just soldiers, but families, scholars, farmers, and artisans. Alamut, according to one account, housed extensive gardens, not merely for beauty, but for sustenance, a reminder that self-sufficiency was key to survival. One legend tells of a mountain spring diverted to supply Alamut with fresh water, an engineering feat that reinforced the idea that the assassins could bend nature itself to their will. Scholars still debate whether these waterworks were as sophisticated as chroniclers claimed, but the story reveals how their enemies marvelled at their ability to endure. From these castles, the assassins projected their power across the region. Messengers carried orders in secret, emissaries moved between strongholds, and when the time came for action, a dagger might find its way into a vizier's chest hundreds of miles from Alamut. Armies could march, battles could rage, but as long as the castle stood, the assassins could not be eradicated. The castles also carried psychological weight. To common villagers, they appeared almost supernatural, stone nests clinging to impossible cliffs, invisible behind mists one day and glinting in sunlight the next. Some believed they were enchanted, protected by spirits or jinn. A chronicler from the 13th century wrote of travellers approaching Alamut at dusk, and swearing that the fortress floated above the clouds, untethered to earth. Was this exaggeration, or simply awe at the scale and isolation? Scholars still debate how much of the assassin reputation was built on physical defences, and how much on the imagination of those who beheld them. But perhaps the greatest strength of these castles was what they symbolised: permanence. In a world where dynasties rose and fell with alarming speed, the assassin fortresses promised endurance. They told their enemies that this sect, though small in number, could not be erased by a single battle or campaign. They would have to be rooted out stone by stone, cliff by cliff, a task no empire managed to complete for more than a century. From the valleys, peasants could look up and see the fortress towers etched against the sky, reminders that power did not always flow from golden palaces or sprawling armies. Sometimes it resided in remote nests, where a handful of determined souls built castles in the clouds, and from them reshaped the politics of empires. Daggers in the dark. The true terror of the assassins did not come from their fortresses alone, but from their uncanny ability to strike where no fortress walls could reach, deep in the heart of enemy courts, at the very centre of power. To kings and sultans, viziers and generals, it was not the sight of Alamut's high towers that kept them awake at night, but the thought of a dagger flashing suddenly in the dark. The tactic was as daring as it was unnerving. Unlike bandits or mercenaries, assassin operatives did not strike from shadows and flee. They acted boldly, often in crowded spaces, with witnesses all around. An emir might be cut down during prayer, a vizier struck while leading a procession, a general stabbed before his soldiers' eyes. The act was not only assassination, it was theatre. Each death was a message, carefully staged to ensure it spread by rumour and fear. One of the earliest and most notorious killings was that of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire, in 1092. Nizam was a formidable administrator and one of Hassan-i Sabbah's greatest enemies. According to chronicles, a young assassin disguised as a wandering dervish approached him and, without hesitation, plunged a dagger into his chest. The blow was more than the end of a statesman. It was the announcement that Hassan's followers had entered the political stage of the Middle East. Armies might march against them, but their reach could strike back into the very tent of command. Such killings earned the sect a reputation that outstripped their numbers. Even though the assassins were never more than a few tens of thousands across all their strongholds, their name became synonymous with sudden, unpredictable death. A curious tidbit from medieval sources claims that some rulers, terrified of assassination, wore armour beneath their robes at all times, even during banquets. Others refused to accept food unless it was prepared under watchful guard. The very possibility of an assassin blade had the power to reshape courtly life. And yet, the assassins were selective. They rarely targeted common people. Their blades were reserved for the powerful, governors, generals, religious leaders. To their followers, this was not mindless terror, but a kind of surgical warfare, a way for a small sect to balance against the might of empires. Scholars still debate whether this method was born of necessity or doctrine, Was it a religiously sanctioned act against oppressors, or simply the only practical way for the assassins to survive? The weapon itself became a symbol. The dagger, short, silent, easily concealed, was as much a tool of propaganda as it was of murder. Chronicles describe assassins approaching their targets with calm certainty, prepared to be cut down immediately after their strike. In this sense, the assassin was both soldier and martyr, offering his life for the cause. To their enemies, this made them all the more frightening. How do you defend against someone who welcomes death as part of the mission? Stories circulated of assassins infiltrating the most secure spaces. One tale, told with relish in Crusader chronicles, claimed that a ruler awoke to find a dagger driven into the ground beside his pillow, a silent warning that he had been spared for now. Whether or not this event truly happened, it illustrates the psychological edge the sect maintained. To live under the threat of the assassins was to live with the knowledge that no guard, no wall, no lock could guarantee safety. These killings, though shocking, also served a diplomatic purpose. Not every dagger found its mark. Sometimes the mere threat was enough to coerce treaties or extract concessions. Armies who thought twice before besieging an assassin fortress often did so because their commanders feared becoming the next target. The act of assassination thus became not only an act of violence, but also a tool of negotiation. The power of the assassin's daggers was magnified by rumour. Chronicles exaggerate numbers, claiming hundreds of victims, though modern historians suggest the true figure was smaller. Still, in an age of uncertainty, perception mattered more than statistics. A single killing in a crowded mosque could echo across empires. A dagger in one court could tremble the hands of rulers hundreds of miles away. As we move deeper into their story, we begin to see that the assassins wielded not just weapons, but psychology. Their daggers were symbols of inevitability, reminders that in a world of armies and empires, sometimes the most powerful blow was delivered not by 1,000 soldiers, but by a single hand, steady and unseen in the heart of the crowd. A garden of illusions. Among the most enduring and enchanting stories about the assassins lies not in their daggers or fortresses, but in a tale of seduction and paradise. For centuries, travellers, chroniclers and poets repeated a curious legend that Hassan-i Sabbah lured his followers with visions of a hidden garden, a place where rivers of milk and wine flowed, where maidens attended the faithful, and where bliss itself was promised. It was said to be an earthly reflection of paradise, and it became known in the West as the Garden of Illusions. The story often takes the following form. Young initiates, loyal but untested, were secretly drugged with hashish and carried into an enclosed garden within Alamut. When they awoke, they found themselves surrounded by delights drawn straight from the Quranic descriptions of heaven. They feasted on fruits and honey, drank wine from crystal goblets, and were entertained by houris, maidens of extraordinary beauty. Then, after some time, they were returned to the stern chambers of Hassan, bewildered but convinced they had tasted the eternal paradise awaiting those who obeyed him. With such certainty, they would follow his commands unto death, believing martyrdom to be the path back to that bliss. It is an irresistible tale, and it captivated Western minds for centuries. In fact, the very word assassin was linked in medieval Europe to hashishin, supposed users of hashish who committed murders in exchange for promises of paradise. Yet here, history becomes slippery. Scholars point out that much of this story first appears in hostile sources, Sunni chroniclers eager to discredit the Ismailis, and later Crusaders who delighted in portraying their eastern rivals as exotic and depraved. The notion of a drugged garden cult may say more about the fears and fantasies of outsiders than about the realities of Alamut. Still, the Assyrian Tory stuck. Marco Polo, travelling through Persia in the 13th century, described the garden in lavish detail. He wrote of high walls surrounding a secret paradise, filled with flowers and fountains, designed so convincingly that initiates believed they had entered heaven itself. It is worth noting, however, that Marco Polo never actually visited Alamut. It had already fallen to the Mongols before his travels. His account, like many, was a patchwork of rumour, hearsay, and imagination. Scholars still debate whether any such garden existed at all, or whether it was simply a metaphor, an allegory for the powerful hold Hassan had over his disciples. A quirky tidbit comes from a much later Persian chronicle that mentions the fortress of Alamut housing elaborate terraced gardens, carefully irrigated with mountain streams. These were real enough, a feat of engineering that allowed the isolated community to grow food and maintain self-sufficiency. Could these gardens have been the seed of the myth? To a foreign traveller, stumbling upon lush terraces in an otherwise barren mountain range, the sight might indeed have seemed otherworldly. Whether real or imagined, the legend of the garden reveals something profound about how the assassins were perceived. To their enemies, it suggested that their loyalty was not born of faith or reason, but of trickery and intoxication. To later European readers, it painted the sect as exotic, dangerous, and strangely alluring, and to modern historians, it is a reminder of how stories once told take on lives of their own. What we can say with certainty is that Hassan-i Sabbah was a master of symbols. He understood the power of myth as much as the power of fortresses and daggers. If he did cultivate a garden of illusions, whether literal or metaphorical, it served its purpose well. It convinced his followers that paradise lay just beyond obedience, and it convinced his enemies that he wielded powers beyond their comprehension. Thus the tale of the garden endures, not as a simple fact, but as a legend woven into the very fabric of the assassin's story. Even today, when we speak of secret societies, of hidden rituals and strange initiations, echoes of that mythical garden whisper in the background, reminding us that sometimes the most potent weapon of all is imagination itself. Training the faithful. If the assassin gardens were legend, the training of their initiates was a far more concrete, and in many ways more impressive, foundation for the sect's reputation. To turn young recruits into the fearless fidai, or self-sacrificing ones, required more than intoxicating visions. It demanded discipline, secrecy, and an education that blended faith with strategy. New disciples often came from villages scattered across Persia and Syria. Some were orphans, others disillusioned youth, many drawn by the promise of belonging to a cause greater than themselves. From the moment they entered an assassin fortress, their old lives dissolved. They were sworn to loyalty, bound by secrecy, and immersed in the teachings of the Ismaili faith. Hassan-i Sabbah and his successors ensured that every recruit understood not only the rituals of prayer, but also the doctrines of obedience. For the assassins, ideology was not abstract, it was a weapon, as sharp as any dagger. Training was a layered process. At the base level, initiates learned to read and memorize scripture. Literacy was rare in medieval Persia, yet the assassins placed high value on it, believing that knowledge was as essential to survival as steel. Alongside theology, they studied languages, mathematics, and even astronomy, subjects that linked them to the broader currents of Islamic scholarship. A young recruit might begin as a servant, then move through ranks of instruction until he was prepared for missions beyond the fortress walls. Physical discipline, too, was relentless. Accounts describe initiates learning the arts of stealth, disguise, and close combat. A quirky tidbit, repeated in several chronicles, tells of fidai practicing by climbing sheer walls of the fortress without ropes, their fingers hardened by constant strain, until they could ascend cliffs like mountain goats. Others trained with daggers until they could strike with uncanny speed and precision. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories highlight the aura of superhuman ability the sect fostered. But the most vital lesson was psychological. From the earliest days, initiates were taught to embrace death, not as an end, but as a gateway. To hesitate in the face of sacrifice was to betray the sect. Chroniclers tell of recruits being ordered to leap from walls or towers at a leader's command, plunging to their deaths as proof of absolute obedience. Scholars still debate whether such spectacles were real or later fabrications, yet they illustrate the perception that assassins cultivated a loyalty beyond reason, an unshakable devotion that no bribe, threat, or torture could break. The hierarchy of the sect reinforced this system. At the top stood the Imam, hidden and revered. His authority passed through Hassan and his successors. Beneath him were the Da'i, missionaries who recruited and instructed. Then came the Rafiq, the companions trained and trusted, but not yet ready for martyrdom. Finally, at the base were the Fida'i, the most feared of all, the ones sent into enemy territory with a single mission, often with the expectation of death. It was this structure that allowed the assassins, small in number, to project influence far beyond their scale. Life within the fortress was not all training and austerity. The assassins built communities, families, and systems of governance. They farmed the terraced fields, maintained libraries, and debated theology. But for the Fida'i, the fortress was also a crucible, forging the kind of single-minded devotion that made their enemies tremble. A vizier might command thousands, a sultan tens of thousands, but neither could be sure of loyalty that matched the assassin's willingness to give his life without hesitation. One particularly haunting story comes from the later Syrian branch under Rashid ad-Din Sinan. When Saladin, the great Muslim leader, besieged assassin fortresses, he was said to have found a note on his bedside table, pinned by a dagger, warning him that even he was not beyond their reach. Some chroniclers claimed that Saladin once awoke to find one of his guards, secretly an assassin, standing over him. Whether or not these tales are true, they underscore the psychological grip of the Fida'i, trained to move unseen, strike fear, and vanish into legend. Scholars today remind us that training such operatives was not simply about fanaticism. It required resources, organization, and patience. The assassins invested decades in creating a network of castles, instructors, and codes of loyalty. It was not madness, but method, a carefully constructed system that transformed scattered youth into disciplined instruments of strategy. And so, within the stone walls of Alamut and its sister fortresses, the faithful were trained. They learned not only how to wield the dagger, but also how to become the dagger, precise, sharp, and unquestioning. It was this training that turned whispers into fear, and fear into legend. Enemies on all sides, for all their fortresses and fearsome reputation, the assassins lived in a world of constant peril. They were never the strongest, never the most numerous, never the richest. From their earliest days, they were hemmed in by enemies on all sides, powerful rulers, rival sects, and even crusading armies from distant lands. Survival meant more than sharp blades. It required a perpetual dance between resistance, negotiation, and cunning. The most immediate and relentless threat came from the Seljuk Turks. At the height of their power, the Seljuks controlled a vast empire, stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. Their sultans viewed the Nizari Ismailis, whom they derisively called heretics, as a dangerous splinter group undermining Sunni orthodoxy. Seljuk viziers, like Nizam al-Mulk, had already fallen to assassin daggers, and so the empire directed campaigns against the mountain fortresses. These were not small raids. Chroniclers describe massive armies, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, marching to encircle assassin strongholds. Yet, time and again, the Seljuks found themselves thwarted. The fortresses, perched on cliffs, were nearly unassailable. Supplies had been stockpiled, water diverted through hidden channels, and defenders prepared to hold out for years. Even when the Seljuks took the fight to open valleys, assassin agents struck back, not with massed armies, but with surgical assassinations that destabilized their enemies' leadership. Beyond the Seljuks, the assassins faced hostility from fellow Muslims. Sunni scholars denounced them as dangerous deviants, accusing them of blasphemy, heresy, or even atheism. The Nizari Ismailis' loyalty to their hidden imam set them apart from the mainstream Shia as well, leaving them isolated even among potential allies. A quirky detail emerges from some chronicles. Preachers in distant Oskirs, far from assassin lands, would warn their congregations not only of eternal damnation, but also of the risk of falling to a dagger in the crowd if they dared to support the sect. Such warnings show how fear extended well beyond the mountain valleys. Then came the Crusaders. By the end of the 11th century, European knights and kings had established footholds in the Levant, colliding with Muslim powers across the region. To the Crusaders, the assassins were both threat and curiosity. Some called them allies when convenient, others fought bitterly against them, but all seemed fascinated by their methods. Stories of cloaked killers who struck without fear spread quickly through European courts, and though exaggerated, they shaped the Western idea of the assassins for centuries to come. The assassins' most dangerous foe of all, however, would be the Mongols. In the 13th century, as the horsemen of the steppe thundered across Asia, they reached Persia with terrifying speed. Unlike the Seljuks or Crusaders, the Mongols were not content to besiege and retreat. They sought total destruction, and when their armies reached the mountain fortresses, even the eagles' nests were not safe. But that is a chapter we will reach later. For now, in the 12th century, the assassins remained locked in a precarious balance. They were surrounded by enemies, but never crushed. They were despised, but never silenced. Scholars still debate how much of their survival came from military genius, and how much from sheer luck in playing enemies against one another. Some argue that Hassan-i Sabbah and his successors were master diplomats, offering truces to one power while striking another. Others believe that their enemies were too divided among themselves to ever mount a coordinated extermination. What is certain is that the assassins turned their enemies' strength into weakness. Vast armies could not easily take mountain strongholds. Powerful rulers feared sleeping at night, knowing a dagger might find them. Even Crusader kings, armoured in steel, wondered whether an unassuming servant or soldier might suddenly reveal himself as a fida'i. This precarious position defined the assassin world. They were never safe, never dominant, always under siege, yet always enduring. Theirs was a life lived on the knife's edge, surrounded by threats, and yet somehow sharper than all of them, fear as a weapon. By now the pattern is clear. The assassins could not hope to defeat empires in open battle. They lacked the vast cavalry of the Seljuks, the crusading zeal of the Franks, or the sheer numbers of the Mongols. But what they did possess, what they refined into a weapon sharper than any blade, was fear. They mastered the art of psychological warfare, creating a power that could rival armies without ever mustering one. The dagger, wielded in crowded markets or sacred mosques, was their symbol. A single killing, staged before witnesses, became a story retold across cities and generations. Leaders did not fear the assassins because of how many they killed, but because of whom they could kill. In an age when rulers relied on personal charisma and fragile alliances, the sudden loss of a sultan's vizier or a general's commander could unravel entire campaigns. Fear, more than force, protected the assassins' mountain strongholds. Contemporaries remarked on how this terror seeped into daily life. Some rulers refused to attend public prayers, dreading the possibility that the man kneeling beside them might be an assassin. Others slept in different chambers each night, changing their guards daily. Chroniclers tell of leaders wearing chainmail under their robes in court. So convinced were they that daggers lurked in every shadow. A quirky tidbit from the 12th century claims that one caliph in Baghdad ordered his food tasters to test not just for poison, but to watch for kitchen servants who might draw knives. Whether true or not, such anecdotes illustrate the climate of paranoia the assassins created. But fear was not only defensive, the assassins wielded it as a diplomatic tool. More than once, rulers who might have attacked their fortresses instead chose to negotiate, preferring uneasy truces over the risk of being targeted. Chroniclers describe emissaries sent from Alamut carrying warnings, polite but unmistakable, that an enemy's safety depended on restraint. A dagger might not even need to be used. The mere threat was often enough to bend the will of powerful men. This strategy worked best because the assassins combined unpredictability with selectivity. They did not slaughter masses indiscriminately. They chose high-profile figures whose deaths would echo. The uncertainty of who might be next kept their enemies off balance. Scholars still debate whether the assassins fully understood the psychological science of their methods, or whether it was instinct born of necessity. Either way, the effect was unmistakable. Their reputation expanded beyond the reality of their numbers. Western Crusaders were particularly fascinated by this aspect of assassin strategy. Chroniclers from Europe wrote with a mix of horror and admiration about a sect whose strength lay in intimidation rather than battle. To knights accustomed to charging fields in gleaming armour, the idea that a single fanatic with a dagger could shift the balance of power seemed almost supernatural. Some even saw it as a kind of dark chivalry, warriors so loyal they embraced certain death for their cause. The assassins also understood that fear required performance. A fidai who struck in broad daylight, in full view of a crowd, ensured that the story could not be hidden or denied. Every witness became a storyteller, every rumour a multiplier of dread. In this way, a single act could ripple outward, magnified until it seemed as if assassins lurked in every city. It is telling that even centuries later, when the assassins as a political force had long since faded, the legends of their terror remained. European languages absorbed the word assassin to mean any killer, though the original sect was far more specific in its aims. That linguistic legacy is perhaps the clearest piece of how effectively they weaponized fear, not merely in their own time but across history itself. Of course, fear is a double-edged sword. It protected the assassins, but it also ensured they would never be trusted. Allies were fleeting, truces fragile, for no ruler could truly relax knowing that the same men who promised friendship today might unsheath daggers tomorrow. Scholars still debate whether this reliance on fear doomed the sect in the long run, isolating them and leaving them vulnerable when the Mongols finally swept across Persia. For now, though, in the 12th century, fear was enough. Armies withdrew, rulers hesitated, and the assassins endured. Their fortresses stood untouched, not because their walls were impregnable, but because the minds of their enemies had already been breached. Fear, carefully cultivated and ruthlessly applied, was their greatest fortress of all. Western legends arise. When the Crusaders first arrived in the Holy Land at the close of the 11th century, they encountered many strange new powers, Saracen princes, Byzantine emperors, and nomadic horsemen from the east. Yet few forces intrigued them as deeply as the mysterious sect nestled in Syrian mountains, the Assassins. To the warriors of Christendom, hardened by battles and yet unfamiliar with the subtleties of Near Eastern politics, the assassins seemed at once terrifying and strangely admirable. Out of this encounter, Western legends began to take shape. The first contacts were not straightforward wars, but uneasy interactions. In Syria, the assassins established footholds such as the fortress of Masyaf, from which their influence spread into Crusader lands. Chroniclers tell of shifting alliances. Sometimes the assassins fought against the Crusaders, other times they entered into truces with them. There are even accounts of assassin envoys appearing in Frankish courts, speaking with lords and kings. This ambiguity only heightened the Crusaders' sense of mystery. Were these mountain men friends, foes, or something else entirely? Western chroniclers, eager for colourful tales, latched onto the strangest aspects of assassin practice. They described fanatical youths who obeyed their master's command unto death, who laughed at the prospect of martyrdom, who wielded daggers in crowded places without hope of escape. To the Crusaders, accustomed to the spectacle of knights in armour charging across fields, such behaviour was both shocking and strangely chivalric. A quirky tidbit emerges in one French chronicle, which claims that some Crusader knights admired assassin devotion so much that they compared it to their own vows of loyalty, though the methods were, of course, worlds apart. It was during these years that the term assassins began to filter into Western vocabulary. The name likely derived from hashishin, an insult used by their enemies in the Muslim world. Yet Europeans took it literally, imagining that these killers were drugged into frenzy before their missions. This idea, though inaccurate, proved irresistible. To audiences in Europe, it transformed the assassins into a blend of fanatics and mystics, a secret cult bound by narcotics and promises of paradise. Scholars still debate whether the Crusaders truly believed this tale or simply repeated it for dramatic effect. The Crusaders also carried home stories of the Old Man of the Mountain, though they often conflated Hassan-i Sabbah with his later Syrian successor, Rashid ad-Din Sinan. In European imagination, there was not a lineage of leaders, but a single immortal figure, commanding assassins for centuries from his mountaintop throne. The exaggeration reflects how the sect was less understood as a political movement, and more as a legend of endurance and menace. One story, popular in Western chronicles, tells of King Amalric of Jerusalem sending envoys to the assassins in the 12th century. The envoys returned full of tales about the sect's terrifying loyalty and their hidden gardens of paradise. Whether or not this meeting actually occurred, it reflects how the Crusaders wove rumour into their own narratives, reshaping the assassins into figures of fascination. What is striking is how quickly the Western imagination transformed them. In Islamic chronicles, the assassins were heretics and rebels, a nuisance to be suppressed. But in Europe, they became exotic figures of wonder, almost like characters from Romance literature. Chroniclers wrote of their stealth, their daring, and their willingness to die. The fear was still there, of course, but it mingled with admiration. To knights steeped in tales of Arthurian bravery, the assassins seemed like a darker mirror of our own ideals. Thus, by the 12th century, the assassins had entered the European imagination not merely as enemies on the battlefield, but as symbols of something larger, the allure of the mysterious East, the terror of secret societies, the fascination with men who lived and died by daggers. The Western legends that arose during the Crusades would prove remarkably durable, colouring everything from medieval chronicles to Renaissance plays, and eventually to modern novels and games. And so, the legend of the assassins began to leave the mountains of Syria and Persia, crossing seas and borders, lodging itself in European folklore, where fact and fable intertwined beyond recognition. Marco Polo's Tales. By the late 13th century, the Mongols had swept through Persia and torn down the eagle's nest at Alamut. The assassin strongholds lay in ruins, their power broken. Yet even in their decline, their legend continued to grow, fueled not by their enemies or allies on the battlefield, but by a traveller whose pen carried their story across continents, Marco Polo. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who journeyed through Asia with his father and uncle, reached Persia in the 1270s, decades after the fall of Alamut. By then, the fortresses were rubble, their libraries burned, their leaders scattered. But the stories remained, carried in the whispers of villagers, the tales of merchants, and the embellishments of court storytellers. Polo gathered these rumours, stitched them together, and recorded them in his famous travels. What he wrote was less history than myth, but it shaped how the West would remember the assassins for centuries. According to Polo, Hassan-i Sabbah, or as he called him, the Old Man of the Mountain, ruled through a secret paradise. Within the walls of Alamut, Polo claimed, lay a magnificent garden designed to mimic the very heaven promised in the Quran. It was filled with flowing rivers, exotic fruits, and maidens of surpassing beauty. The old man, Polo wrote, would drug young men with a sleeping potion, carry them into this garden, and then awaken them to a vision of bliss. Later he would remove them, tell them they had glimpsed true paradise, and remind them that obedience to his will was the only path back to it. Armed with this vision, the youths would follow any command, even unto certain death. Thus, Polo explained, the old man created a corps of fanatical assassins, men who would kill kings and die gladly, certain of heavenly reward. It is a story that dazzled Polo's European readers. They had already heard whispers of the assassin from Crusaders, but Polo's account gave it shape, detail, and vivid imagery. Here was no vague rumour of fanatics, but a fully realised tale of deception, paradise, and narcotics. A quirky tidbit appears in some later editions of Polo's book. Illustrations of lush gardens with walls higher than castles, complete with fountains and courtesans. These depictions cemented the idea of the assassins not as a persecuted sect, but as a secret cult of pleasure and death. Of course, historians today are skeptical. By the time Polo travelled through Persia, Alamut had already been destroyed by Hulagu Khan's Mongol armies in 1256. There was no paradise garden to see, no fortress left standing. Scholars still debate where Polo got his information, whether from Persian guides, Mongol officials, or imaginative storytellers in caravanserais. Some suggest he simply repeated older tales already circulating in Crusader and Islamic sources, embellishing them for his European audience. Others argue he may have heard distorted memories of Alamut's terraced gardens, which did exist and were used to grow food in isolation. Regardless of its accuracy, Polo's tale had power. In an age when most Europeans knew little of the East, his book became a window into a world of marvels, and within that window the assassins loomed large, not as a sect of persecuted Ismailis, but as shadowy manipulators, drugging disciples and unleashing them upon the world. The story was too captivating to question. Over time, Polo's version of events merged with earlier Crusader legends. Together they created a lasting myth. The word assassin became inseparable from ideas of hashish, paradise gardens, and fearless killers under the command of an immortal old man of the mountain. Even today, traces of Polo's tale linger in popular culture, from novels to video games. So, while the physical stones of Alamut lay in ruin, Marco Polo ensured that the assassins would never truly disappear. In the pages of his travels, they were reborn, not as history, but as legend, carried across the seas to shape Western imagination for generations to come. Between fact and fable, by the 13th century, the assassins had already become legends. Their story passed through so many hands that truth and invention blurred beyond recognition. Chroniclers, crusaders, and travellers like Marco Polo gave Europe an image of shadowy killers drugged with hashish, enchanted gardens hidden behind mountain walls, and immortal masters commanding daggers at will. But behind these tales was a sect of flesh and blood, bound by real politics, faith, and survival. Separating fact from fable has become one of the historian's most enduring challenges. Let us begin with the name itself, assassin. For centuries, Europeans believed it came from hashishin, suggesting that the sect used drugs to control its followers. This fit neatly with Polo's account of Gardens of Illusion, creating an exotic picture of intoxicated youths sent to kill. But many scholars today argue the word may instead have been a slur coined by enemies to discredit the Ismailis. In Arabic, hashish could mean not only the drug, but also outcasts or rabble. If so, the assassins were never truly hashish eaters, but victims of a label meant to strip them of respectability. Scholars still debate which interpretation holds truest, drug users or social outcasts, but both reflect how outsiders sought to explain their fearsome devotion. The garden myth, too, is a puzzle. We know that Alamut had terraced fields and water channels, real engineering feats that allowed its people to survive long sieges. Could these terraces have inspired tales of paradise gardens? Possibly. A 12th century Persian chronicler described lush orchards within the fortress, hardly miraculous but still unusual for such a high rocky perch. A quirky tidbit even claims that Alamut's apples were so sweet they were sought after in nearby markets. Could this humble orchard, magnified by rumour, have transformed into Marco Polo's heavenly pleasure garden? Perhaps. The practice of drugging recruits is even murkier. No reliable Ismaili source mentions it. Instead, the assassins spoke of loyalty, discipline, and faith in the hidden imam. Yet enemies found it easier to explain such unflinching devotion as the product of intoxication rather than conviction. To believe that young men would die for their sect willingly was troubling. To imagine them tricked by hashish and illusions was somehow more palatable to those who feared them. The fable told outsiders more about their own anxieties than about assassin reality. Even the figure of the Old Man of the Mountain is a composite myth. Hassan-i Sabbah, the founder, died in 1124. His successors in Persia and later Syria carried on his methods, yet Western chroniclers fused them into a single immortal being, as though one man had ruled for centuries. This image of an ageless master weaving plots across generations was irresistible to storytellers, though wholly at odds with the facts of succession and leadership. What we can say with certainty is this: the assassins were Nizari Ismailis, a branch of Shia Islam persecuted by Sunni rulers. They created fortified networks in Persia and Syria, ruled with strict discipline, and employed targeted killings to defend themselves against far stronger enemies. They valued knowledge, built libraries, and preserved their faith under constant siege. Their methods were ruthless, yes, but not mindless. They were a strategic adaptation to the pressures of their age. And yet, the legends are no less important than the facts. For the assassins themselves, rumour was a weapon. They knew their reputation spread faster than any army, and they cultivated it carefully. If enemies whispered of daggers in the night or gardens of paradise, so much the better. Fear, after all, was their strongest defence. In his sense, the fables are part of the truth, not because they describe reality, but because they describe how reality was perceived. Scholars still debate how much of what we know about the assassins is history, and how much is propaganda. Were they drugged fanatics or disciplined devotees? Were their gardens real orchards or imagined heavens? The answers may never be clear, but perhaps the more important truth lies in the interplay itself, that the assassins lived on the line between fact and fable, crafting their identity in the shadows, where both could thrive. Thus, when we speak of them today, we are not only recalling history, we are recalling stories shaped and reshaped through centuries of fear, fascination, and imagination. The assassins were real, but their legend was greater, and in the end, both were essential to their survival. Fall of Alamut. For nearly 2 centuries, the fortresses of the assassins stood as stone eagles' nests, defying sultans and outlasting Crusader kings. But no fortress, however high or cunningly provisioned, could withstand the thunder of the Mongols. In the mid-13th century, the storm from the steppes broke over Persia, and with it came the end of Alamut. The Mongols, led by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, were unlike any enemy the assassins had faced. They were ruthless, methodical, and relentless. Where the Seljuks had retreated and the Crusaders negotiated, the Mongols pressed forward with one aim: total annihilation. Their campaigns had already reduced great cities like Nishapur and Baghdad to ash and bone. When their horsemen turned their gaze toward the assassin strongholds, the outcome was grimly predictable. In 1256, Hulagu launched a campaign against the Nizari Ismailis of Persia. At this time, the assassin leader was Rukn al-Din Kursha, a far less imposing figure than Hassan-i Sabbah. Unlike his formidable ancestor, Kursha faced the Mongols not with defiance but with despair. He attempted negotiation, offering to dismantle fortresses and submit to Hulagu's power. A quirky tidbit from some chronicles says that he even ordered parts of Alamut's defences to be dismantled in good faith, hoping to placate the invaders, but the Mongols, who dealt in conquest not compromise, pressed forward anyway. Alamut itself, once thought impregnable, fell without the apocalyptic siege many had imagined. After a brief resistance, Kursha surrendered in late 1256. The Mongols entered the fortress, tore down its walls, and set fire to its fabled libraries. Accounts claim that priceless manuscripts, works of philosophy, theology, and science were consigned to flames or tossed into rivers. One Persian historian lamented that a treasure of human thought was lost forever in those fires. Scholars still debate whether this destruction was as complete as described. Some texts may have survived, hidden in secret caches, but the symbolic blow was undeniable. The assassins did not vanish overnight. Some fortresses resisted longer, like Girdku, which held out for years even after Alamut's fall. Yet the network had been broken. With Alamut destroyed and its leader executed, the sect was left fractured and leaderless. The Mongols, efficient in their brutality, pursued survivors, razing strongholds and scattering communities. What had once been a thorn in the side of empires was now reduced to scattered embers. Still, the assassin's reputation endured. Chroniclers describe Mongol generals wary of lingering too long in assassin territory, lest hidden daggers find them in the night. In one curious story, Hulagu himself reportedly hesitated to enter Alamut until convinced it was safe. So deep ran the legends of unseen killers. Even in their destruction, fear lingered like smoke after fire. The fall of Alamut also marked the beginning of the assassin legend as a tale of loss and memory. To their enemies, it was proof that no sect, however mysterious, could withstand Mongol wrath. To their scattered followers, it was martyrdom, the price of loyalty to their hidden imam. For later historians, it became a symbol of the fragile line between endurance and annihilation in a world of shifting empires. Scholars still debate whether Rukn al-Din Kursha could have chosen differently, whether defiance might have preserved the sect's honour, or whether surrender spared countless lives. In the end, his choice made little difference. The Mongols left little but ruin behind, and the once mighty eagle's nest of Alamut was reduced to rubble. And yet, even in ruin, Alamut did not truly vanish. Its memory lived on in chronicles, in whispered tales, and in the very word assassin, which continued to circulate long after the stones had fallen. The fortress may have been destroyed, but the legend of Alamut had only begun to grow. Scattered survivors. The fall of Alamut was a catastrophe, but it was not the end. Like sparks carried by the wind after a fire, the assassins scattered across mountains, valleys, and cities, refusing to let their sect vanish entirely. Broken though they were, they survived, not as a great fortress-bound power, but as fragments of a brotherhood, half hidden, whispering their existence into new generations. In Persia, some survivors retreated into remote valleys of the Elburz mountains, eking out lives in secrecy. A few strongholds like Girdku resisted Mongol conquest for years, holding out against hunger and encirclement until finally overwhelmed. Even after those fortresses fell, small assassin communities persisted, maintaining the memory of Hassan-i Sabbah and their devotion to the Nizari imams. In oral traditions, they told stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and paradise, ensuring that their children remembered who they were. Meanwhile, in Syria, the assassins' fortunes fared somewhat better. There, their stronghold of Masyaf and others endured, shifting cautiously between alliances with Crusaders, local emirs, and eventually the rising power of the Mamluks. Rashid ad-Din Sinan, remembered as the Syrian Old Man of the Mountain, had already established a reputation that rivaled Hassan himself. His successors continued to wield daggers and diplomacy in equal measure, carving out a precarious survival amid a landscape dominated by stronger powers. A quirky tidbit appears in a 14th century European account, which claims that even after their downfall in Persia, assassin emissaries were still spotted in far-off courts, sometimes in Cairo, sometimes even in Mongol courts themselves. One story tells of an assassin disguised as a Sufi mystic who gained access to a Khan's tent, only to reveal himself at the last moment. True or not, these stories reflect how the sect's reputation lingered long after its structures had collapsed. The survivors were not merely militants. Many turned inward, focusing on preserving their religious identity. Hidden within the folds of Ismaili communities, the memory of the Nizari faith endured quietly, passed down through secret teachings. Their survival strategy shifted from fortresses of stone to fortresses of memory and doctrine. Scholars still debate how much of the original assassin hierarchy survived intact, but there is evidence of continuing leadership, often underground, linking scattered groups back to the hidden line of imams. In time, the sect's remnants would re-emerge in new forms. In Persia, the Nizari Ismailis adapted to Mongol and later Timurid rule, living quietly under the radar of larger powers. In Syria, they remained a small but noticeable presence, sometimes entering alliances, sometimes suffering persecution, but always persisting. Their ability to survive without drawing attention was itself a testament to the flexibility that had once allowed them to outwit sultans and crusaders alike. And still their legend travelled. Merchants, pilgrims and chroniclers carried tales of surviving assassins, ready to strike again from hidden lairs. In Europe, where imagination often outpaced fact, the idea that the assassins had been wiped out never fully took hold. Instead, whispers spread that they were waiting, hidden in mountains, poised to rise again. This resilience reveals something important. The assassins were never just about fortresses or daggers. They were a community, a faith, a network of shared identity. When the stones of Alamut fell, that network bent but did not break. It adapted, reshaped itself, and persisted in the margins of history. Scholars still debate whether their survival was due more to careful organization or to the sheer inability of conquerors to erase a faith. Perhaps it was both. Thus, even as the Mongols celebrated their conquest and chroniclers declared the assassins finished, the sect's heart still beat quietly in hidden valleys and whispered prayers. The Brotherhood of Daggers had become a brotherhood of survivors, scattered but enduring, their legend stronger than their armies, their faith stronger than their ruins. Echoes in the Ottoman age. As centuries rolled forward, the mighty Mongols fractured, Crusader kingdoms crumbled, and the medieval world gave way to new empires. Yet the echoes of the assassins did not fall silent. Though their fortresses lay in ruin and their sect reduced to scattered enclaves, their legend reverberated into the Ottoman age, shaping how rulers, travellers, and common folk alike imagined secret brotherhoods lurking in the shadows of power. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottoman Empire expanded across the Middle East, absorbing lands once held by both Crusaders and Mongols. Within these territories, small Nizari Ismaili communities still existed, often hidden among mountain populations. They no longer wielded daggers in daylight or staged public assassinations. Instead, they maintained their faith quietly, practicing in secrecy to avoid persecution. Still, their name lingered, often invoked as a warning. In some Ottoman chronicles, to accuse a rival of being an assassin was to brand him dangerous, heretical, and disloyal. The assassin's reputation also seeped into folklore. Stories of shadowy killers loyal to an unseen master circulated through bazaars and coffee houses, taking on lives of their own. A quirky tidbit survives in Ottoman storytelling. Some tales claimed that the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the sultans, were modelled after the assassins, trained in loyalty and discipline that rivaled the Fidari of old. The comparison was flattering, though entirely imagined, for the Janissaries were moulded by different traditions. Yet the rumour reveals how the memory of the assassins became a cultural reference point for what absolute loyalty could mean. European travellers during this era, wandering through Ottoman lands, eagerly collected such tales. Renaissance scholars and adventurers repeated the stories of Marco Polo and the Crusaders, airing them with local gossip. To these travellers, the old man of the mountain was no longer simply a medieval figure. He had become an eternal archetype of the mysterious East, a sorcerer commanding killers from hidden lairs. Some even speculated that the sect had never truly died, but continued in disguise, infiltrating courts and conspiracies across the Islamic world. Scholars still debate whether these whispers were fueled by genuine remnants of assassin communities or by the irresistible allure of their legend. The Ottomans themselves occasionally encountered surviving Ismaili groups. In mountainous Syria, pockets of Nizari communities persisted into the Ottoman era, still remembered by their neighbours as the heirs of the assassins. They no longer launched high-profile missions, but their reputation lingered like smoke after fire. Local rulers sometimes accused them of plotting or invoked their name to explain unexplained deaths. In this way, even when they acted no more violently than their neighbours, the old fears clung stubbornly. As Europe entered its own age of discovery and empire, the assassin legend was rediscovered again in books and plays. Writers in Venice, Paris, and London drew on Ottoman accounts, fusing them with Polo's stories to paint a picture of exotic, dangerous sects. By now, fact and fiction were hopelessly entangled. The assassins had become more myth than memory, their actual history obscured by the power of rumour, and yet this myth had power. In an Ottoman world of secret courts, shifting alliances, and sudden executions, the idea of hidden assassins pulling unseen strings felt uncomfortably plausible. To live under an empire where sultans themselves could be strangled overnight by palace guards was to understand, in a way, the psychological weapon the assassins had once wielded. Perhaps that is why their story continued to resonate. It spoke to the enduring human fear of death without warning, delivered by hands unseen. Scholars still debate how much continuity truly connected the medieval assassins to later Ismaili communities under Ottoman rule. Was it the same sect in new form, or simply the ghost of a reputation that never died? Whatever the case, the echoes were loud enough to ensure that the assassin's legend remained a living presence, centuries after Alamut had fallen. And so, even in the Ottoman age, the assassins lived on, not in their fortresses, not in their daggers, but in the imagination of rulers and peoples who could not forget them. The echoes of their story proved louder than their silence, from sect to symbol. By the early modern era, the assassins had ceased to exist as a military force. Their fortresses were long fallen, their armies scattered, their daggers no longer gleamed in the courts of kings. Yet paradoxically, this was when they became most powerful, in the realm of language, imagination, and symbol. What had begun as a small, embattled sect in the mountains of Persia and Syria now lived on as an idea, one that would outlast empires. The transformation can be seen first in words. In European languages, assassin no longer referred to a specific religious order, but to the act itself, a killer striking down the powerful, often for political ends. French chronicles of the 14th century began using assassin generically, and by Shakespeare's time, the word appeared on the English stage. To call someone an assassin was to conjure images not only of murder, but of secrecy, fanatic devotion, and inevitability. The word carried the weight of centuries of myth, from Marco Polo's pleasure gardens to the Crusaders' tales of fanatics leaping from battlements at a master's command. This transformation reveals a curious irony. The assassins themselves were disciplined, strategic, and selective in their violence. They killed to defend their sect, to intimidate rulers, to carve out survival. Yet in language they became shorthand for indiscriminate killers, shadows lurking behind every political murder. Scholars still debate whether this linguistic shift was a distortion of their legacy or its natural evolution. Perhaps both. Their myth was always larger than their reality, and language merely carried the myth forward. The symbolic power of the assassins extended beyond words. In Europe's age of exploration, tales of secret brotherhoods and hidden sects proliferated. From Freemasons to Rosicrucians, clandestine societies fascinated both rulers and the public. Writers often drew parallels with the assassins, presenting them as the archetype of hidden orders that could move unseen yet shape the fate of nations. The assassins became a template upon which later conspiracies were imagined. A quirky tidbit appears in a 17th century French text which claimed, falsely, that the assassins still existed in disguise, manipulating Ottoman politics. The author even suggested that European rulers should learn from them, using selective assassination as a more efficient tool than war. This blending of admiration and fear shows how deeply the assassins had entered the European imagination, not only as villains, but as teachers of dark political wisdom. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the name assassin remained a mark of infamy. Sunni scholars continued to denounce the sect as heretics, while local folklore preserved them as cautionary figures. Yet within Ismaili communities, the story was remembered differently. They were not fanatics or drugged killers, but loyal defenders of a persecuted faith, martyrs who sacrificed themselves for survival. The same history split into two narratives, one of vilification, the other of reverence. This divergence only fueled the symbolic potency of the assassins. To one audience, they represented treachery and deceit. To another, endurance and devotion. To yet another, they were an exotic curiosity, a tale to spice the chronicles of distant lands. Few groups in history have been so completely transformed into metaphor. By the modern era, their symbol had travelled even further. Writers, dramatists, and eventually novelists turned them into characters of romance and intrigue. Secret assassins appeared in Renaissance plays, Victorian novels, and, in time, the stories of pulp fiction and cinema. Each retelling added new layers until the historical sect of Hassan-i Sabbah was almost unrecognisable beneath the cloak of myth. Scholars still debate whether this erasure is a tragedy or a testament to the assassins' enduring mystique. Perhaps, like their fortresses hidden in the clouds, their truth was always meant to be partly obscured. What is undeniable is that by becoming a symbol, the assassins achieved a strange immortality. Though their stones were toppled and their leaders slain, their name became a permanent part of human vocabulary, a shorthand for fear, secrecy, and the lethal power of belief. Thus, the assassins' legacy shifted from history into metaphor. They ceased to be a sect of men bound by mountain fortresses and became instead a symbol that crossed languages, cultures, and centuries. From sect to symbol, that was their final transformation, and it ensured they would never be forgotten. The enduring enigma. Centuries after the fall of Alamut, the assassins remain one of history's most enduring enigmas. Their fortresses are rubble, their libraries long burned, their leaders reduced to names in chronicles. Yet their legend survives, reborn in every age, reshaped by every storyteller, still alive in our language and imagination. Few groups of the medieval world command such fascination today, not for the size of their armies or the span of their empire, but for the shadows they cast across time. The mystery endures because the assassins occupied a unique space. They were neither empire nor sect alone, but something in between. They were a persecuted minority who refused to vanish, carving out survival with daggers and fortresses. They were scholars and farmers, ascetics and martyrs, yet remembered chiefly as killers. The contradiction itself, faith and fanaticism, devotion and dread, ensured that their story would never be simple. Western imagination, fueled by Crusader chronicles and Marco Polo's tales, gave them a mythic dimension. To Europeans, they became exotic avatars of secrecy and terror, their supposed hashish-filled gardens as intoxicating in story as in fantasy. Eastern memory, by contrast, preserved them as heretics or martyrs, depending on perspective. Between these poles lies the truth, a community struggling for survival in a world of empires that saw them as enemies. Scholars still debate whether their legacy should be read as tragedy, triumph, or simply testament to human resilience. A quirky tidbit from archaeology underscores how myth and memory intertwine. In the 20th century, excavations at Alamut uncovered remnants of terraced gardens and irrigation channels, lending some support to stories of its lush cultivation. Not paradise, perhaps, but proof that amid stone and siege, the assassins cultivated beauty and self-sufficiency in theirs. At Fragile Detail, an apple orchard on a barren mountain, we glimpse the humanity behind the legend. The endurance of their enigma also speaks to something larger. Across cultures, we remain captivated by the idea of hidden societies, of secret brotherhoods moving unseen to shape the world. From Renaissance conspiracies to modern fiction, the assassins provided the archetype. They remind us of the power of fear, the allure of secrecy, and the fragility of truth. To speak their name today is to summon centuries of stories, some true, many false, all compelling. Perhaps that is why the assassins still grip us. They embody the tension between fact and fable, history and myth. They remind us that survival can take many forms, not only in armies and empires, but in whispers, in symbols, in words. They remind us that the sharpest weapon is not always the blade itself, but the fear it inspires. And so long after their fortresses have crumbled, the assassins endure. Not as a sect in the mountains, but as a story that refuses to die, a legend that still haunts the imagination of the world. Conclusion. The assassins began as a small, embattled sect in the mountains of Persia, seeking survival amid empires that dwarfed them. They built fortresses in the clouds, trained disciples in secrecy and sacrifice, and wielded daggers not just as weapons, but as instruments of fear. Their reputation spread far beyond their numbers, magnified by rumour, myth, and the pens of their enemies. Even after Alamut fell to the Mongols, their legend persisted, carried by Crusaders, embroidered by Marco Polo, and immortalized in language itself. Today, their story is neither holy history nor holy fable. It is a mirror reflecting the fears and fascinations of every age that retold it. The assassins endure because they represent something timeless, the power of the few against the many, the mystery of hidden societies, the thin line between faith and fanaticism. They are gone, yet they are everywhere, in our words, our stories, our imagination,